So I am a pretty big fan of the Indiana Jones movies. And I admit there are a few racial issues which seem a lot dodgier in the 2020s than they did back in the 1980s. And I know there's been some new thinking about what artifacts do and do not belong in museums. Like maybe we should leave artifacts with the descendants of the people who created them and just put replicas in museums. But overall, the movies give us an adventuring archaeologist who fights Nazis. So what is not to like? I even think the fourth movie that nobody admits to liking, it has some bright points. One of these moments has Indy land on a table in his college's library as a result of a fight. And the student who's sitting there studying is all bland and blasé about his professor just landing in his homework. Oh, Dr. Jones, I have some questions about the next exam. And Indy throws a punch at the person who's attacking him, runs off and yells back to the student, if you want to learn archaeology, you have to get out of the library. So in our gospel reading today, we have Jesus appear in a place where no Jesus is expected to be. And given that everyone thinks he's quite thoroughly dead, this is way more dramatic than being thrown onto a library table. And Jesus then tells the disciples, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. In other words, if you want to learn how to be the church, you have to get out of this locked room. Well, this is a little more difficult than Indy telling his student to take a field assignment over the summer. There is a very real danger to the disciples if they go out according to Jesus's instructions. The temple authorities and the Romans would probably leave them alone if they just kept quiet and went back to their old lives. In those days, there had been more than a few leaders and potential messiahs who had been executed by Rome. Usually after the leader died, that leader's disciples would disperse and there wouldn't be any further trouble because the Romans were then satisfied with that grotesque and violent example they had made of the leader. This was normally more than enough to keep other people from getting rebellious ideas. Jesus is telling the disciples now to do exactly the opposite of what Rome wants and expects. Did any of them have second thoughts upon hearing, as the Father has sent me, so I send you? They're looking at their resurrected friend with the massive puncture wounds in his shattered wrists and ankles, and the big bleeding gouge in his side from the sharp Roman spear. Like, wait a minute, if you send us like the Father sent you, are we going to be broken and murdered too? I might have taken a couple of steps back if I had been there. Let me think this over for a few minutes, Jesus. The resurrection was obviously real. They were looking at it, right at it. But the suffering, that was real too. And they could see it just as clearly. What does it mean to be sent by Jesus as the Father sent Jesus? What does it mean to live into the crucifixion and the resurrection? To the disciples and the early church, it really did mean imprisonment and martyrdom for the sake of the word. There are gruesome legends about how nearly all of them were executed at the hands of various worldly powers. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. Matthias was burned to death in Syria. Thomas, killed by soldiers with spears in India. Honestly, I think it was very wise of Thomas to want to see the risen Lord for himself. Maybe his thought wasn't so much, I don't believe you, as it was, I want to see both aspects of this before I decide what to do. I want to see the glory more than I can even say, but I really should be aware of the suffering too. Over these past 2,000 years, the empires of the world and the systems that keep them propped up, they've wised up. execution and imprisonment are no longer the go-to ways to stop the church's mission. Now the plan is to divert, to distract, to outright subvert the message of Christ and the meaning of the crucifixion and resurrection into one where the signs of God's favor appear in respectability and status quo and material wealth. Do you all remember that old Janis Joplin song where she prays for a Mercedes-Benz and a color TV and a night on the town? In the recording I have of it, it's so obvious that she's laughing while she's singing it. She is not intending this to be taken seriously by anyone. But there are enough successful prosperity gospel preachers out there that we know there are people who seriously do take material wealth as a sign of salvation. The world, which doesn't want to change, promises us security, comfort, the safety of a locked room. The locked room promises not only that we don't have to go out, but no one undesirable can come in. It promises us freedom from suffering. And Jesus never promised us that at all. He pretty much promised that we would suffer, saying, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me, the way Mark wrote it. This is not an easy promise to sit with. And it's one that will look different for every individual follower of Jesus at different times in their life. Maybe for a little 4-year-old, it looks like learning to share. Maybe for someone in their 80s, it looks like learning to forgive. Maybe for someone who's always been nervous about other people's opinion, it might look like learning to be their own Jesus-loving self openly. For Holy Cross, it might look like uncomfortable conversations with community members to learn about the outreach needs Novi has. For the church as a whole, it's going to look like racial reconciliation and environmental justice. These are all long processes. Learning to live as a follower of Jesus, someone who has died and been resurrected into a new life, that takes a whole lifetime, maybe longer. For me, in a few months' time, following Jesus is going to lead me away from here, away from the safety of this room, to do an internship at another church. But this room, this church, this has never been a locked room. This is more like what Jesus found on his second visit to the disciples when Thomas is there. They are still all in this house all together, but now the doors are shut. They're not locked. And Jesus does not get cranky about them being inside. So I imagine that they've been very busy over the last week. They're coming and going and making plans, wondering, how do they tell the story of Jesus? And who should they tell? And should their outreach be big and flashy, or should it be quiet and dignified? So on this second Sunday of Easter, it's no wonder they've all gathered together. They have been busy, they've been preparing. Now they're taking strength from being in each other's company, from being the very beginning of the church and community. And Jesus approves of their togetherness. He comes in and he tells them, peace be with you. Every week at the end of our service, we are sent into the world in peace to love and serve the Lord. And every week before we go out, we take a pause and we have coffee hour. We take that break for community and to experience the Christ we see in each other. Joy and strength and courage from each other's company before we take up our crosses in the world. May it always be so, and may it always be blessed. Amen.